There are moments in television history that transcend entertainment and become something more, moments that capture lightning in a bottle, moments that could never be replicated, no matter how hard you tried. This is the story of one of those moments. It involves two legendary entertainers, a broken object, a public confrontation on live television, and a friendship so deep and genuine that they could turn potential disaster into comedy gold. Johnny Carson, Don Rickles, and a cigarette box. The year was 1973. Don Rickles, the undisputed king of insult comedy, the man who could destroy anyone with words, did something he'd never done before. He made Johnny Carson genuinely, legitimately angry. Well, sort of. What happened next became one of the most celebrated moments in Tonight Show history. A moment that gets replayed at every Carson tribute. A moment that Rickles himself told and retold for the next 40 years. A moment that perfectly captured the golden age of television when two masters of their craft could take a real-life accident and transform it into pure entertainment. This is the story of the night Don Rickles came on The Tonight Show, not to promote a project, not to tell jokes, not to roast celebrities, but to answer for his crimes. The crime? Destroying Johnny Carson's most prized possession. The confrontation? Absolutely legendary. Let's go back to 1973 and discover what really happened when the master of insult comedy had to face the king of late-night television. To understand why this moment was so perfect, you need to understand the relationship between Johnny Carson and Don Rickles. They weren't just colleagues. They weren't just two entertainers who occasionally appeared together. They were genuine friends, deep friends, the kind of friends who could say anything to each other because the foundation of love and respect was unshakable. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show from 1962 to 1992, 30 years of late-night dominance. During that time, he interviewed thousands of guests. But only a handful were considered regulars, people who could show up and instantly make magic happen. Don Rickles was at the very top of that list. Don Rickles, born in 1926, was the pioneer of insult comedy. He built an entire career on saying what nobody else dared to say. He would viciously mock celebrities, politicians, audience members. Nobody was safe. But here's what made Rickles special. It was never mean-spirited. Somehow, through the force of his personality and the obvious joy he took in his craft, being insulted by Don Rickles became an honor. If Rickles made fun of you, it meant you'd arrived. You were somebody. He called Frank Sinatra a bullet head. He told Ronald Reagan to sit down and shut up. He insulted Bob Hope to his face at Hope's own events. And everyone loved it, because underneath the insults, you could feel the warmth, the love, the genuine affection Rickles had for people and for making them laugh. When Don Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show, it was appointment television. People would call their friends, "Rickles is on Carson tonight. You have to watch." Carson would sit at his desk, trying to maintain his composure as Rickles went off on increasingly outrageous tangents. Rickles would insult Carson, the band, the audience, the sponsors, everyone. And Johnny would laugh, really laugh. Not the polite host laugh he gave to mediocre guests. Real, genuine, can't-help-himself laughter. Carson loved Rickles because Rickles was unpredictable. You never knew what he was going to say. The Tonight Show was normally a carefully controlled environment. But when Rickles showed up, all bets were off. And Rickles loved Carson because Carson could keep up with him. Johnny's quick wit and perfect timing meant he could volley back, creating these incredible improvised comedy duels that had audiences in stitches. But beyond the comedy, there was deep mutual respect. Carson recognized that Rickles was a master of his craft. The timing, the delivery, the ability to read a room and adjust on the fly. Rickles was operating at a level few comedians ever reached. And Rickles recognized that Carson was the best in the business, the most powerful person in entertainment. One Tonight Show appearance could make a career, and Carson had chosen to be friends with Rickles, to regularly feature him, to give him a platform. Off camera, they socialized. Dinners, phone calls. They were part of the same Hollywood social circle. Their wives were friends. This wasn't just a professional relationship, which is why what happened with the cigarette box became so significant. When you have that kind of friendship, when you trust someone completely, when you know them well enough to understand their boundaries, and then you cross one of those boundaries, how do you handle it? Carson and Rickles were about to show the world exactly how. Before we get to what happened, you need to understand the significance of the object at the center of this story. Johnny Carson's desk on The Tonight Show wasn't just a desk. It was an iconic piece of American television. Millions of viewers saw it every single night for 3 decades. And on that desk sat a beautiful ceramic cigarette box. This was Carson's personal possession, a gift from someone important to him. It sat on his desk every night, a familiar presence that regular viewers recognized. In the 1970s, smoking on television was still common. Carson would smoke cigarettes during interviews. The cigarette box was both functional and decorative, a piece of his personal style visible to millions. It was, in a very real way, part of The Tonight Show's identity. And Don Rickles broke it. Not on purpose, not as a joke. He just broke it. And then everything that followed became the stuff of legend. NBC's Burbank, California, in the 1970s were a hive of television production. Multiple shows filming simultaneously. Sets next to each other. Sound stages where America's favorite entertainment was being created. In 1973, 2 particular shows were filming in close proximity: The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson and CPO Sharkey, a sitcom starring Don Rickles. CPO Sharkey was Don Rickles' big shot at sitcom stardom. He'd been a stand-up comedian and character actor for years, but this was his chance to headline his own show. It was a Navy comedy. Rickles played a tough-talking chief petty officer dealing with recruits. The show filmed on the NBC lot, close enough to The Tonight Show that people from one production would occasionally visit the other. And that's how the incident happened. The exact details of how Rickles ended up on The Tonight Show set vary slightly depending on who's telling the story. But the general narrative is this. During a break in filming CPO Sharkey, Don Rickles and some of his cast/crew decided to visit The Tonight Show set. Maybe they were giving a tour to someone. Maybe Rickles wanted to show off to his colleagues. Maybe he just felt like wandering over to say hi to the Tonight Show crew. The Tonight Show wasn't filming at the time. The set was empty. Johnny Carson wasn't there. So Rickles and his group walked onto the famous set. They looked around. Maybe Rickles sat in Carson's chair. Maybe he did some jokes for his friends, pretending to be Johnny. And then someone, accounts differ on whether it was Rickles himself or someone he was with, knocked over the cigarette box. And it shattered. The beautiful ceramic cigarette box that had sat on Johnny Carson's desk for years, that millions of Americans had seen. That was Carson's personal possession. Broken, destroyed, pieces all over the floor. There was a moment of stunned silence. Everyone knew immediately that this was bad. This was breaking a prop. This was breaking Johnny Carson's personal item. And not just any item. Something that was on television every night. Something that would be noticed if it suddenly disappeared. According to later interviews, Rickles' first instinct was panic. This was Johnny Carson. His friend, yes, but also the most powerful man in entertainment. The man who could make or break careers. And Rickles had just broken something personal of his. Rickles later said he immediately thought, "I'm dead. My career is over. Johnny's going to kill me." He and his group quickly cleaned up the mess. They gathered the pieces. They put them somewhere. Maybe in a bag. Maybe in a box. The details get fuzzy. And then they left. Quickly, the Tonight Show crew eventually discovered what had happened. Someone had broken Carson's cigarette box. And based on who'd been on the set, it wasn't hard to figure out who was responsible. And when Johnny Carson learned that his cigarette box had been broken, his first question was probably, who did this? When he found out it was Don Rickles, his reaction was likely complex. On one hand, this was his friend. Accidents happen. It's just an object. On the other hand, this was his personal possession, on his desk, that everyone recognized, and Rickles had been on his set when he wasn't there and had broken it. But Carson, genius that he was, immediately saw the opportunity here. Instead of handling this privately, instead of just accepting Rickles' apology off camera and moving on, he could make this television. Johnny Carson decided to invite Don Rickles onto The Tonight Show specifically to confront him about the broken cigarette box, publicly, on live television, in front of millions of viewers. It was a masterstroke for several reasons. First, it took what could have been an awkward private situation and turned it into entertainment. Second, it gave Rickles a chance to do what he did best, talk his way out of trouble with humor. Third, it gave Carson a chance to play a role he rarely got to play, the wounded party, the victim, the guy demanding answers. Fourth, and most importantly, it was honest, real, unscripted. The audience would know this actually happened, which made it so much funnier. Carson knew his audience. He knew Rickles, he knew that this had the potential to be comedy gold. He just had to set the stage correctly. They let him know that Johnny wanted him to come on the show, to address the cigarette box incident, on air. Rickles knew he had no choice. You don't turn down a Johnny Carson invitation. Plus, he probably knew that this was his chance to make things right and to make it funny. But he was also nervous, because while Carson was his friend, he was also a master performer, and Rickles genuinely didn't know how angry Johnny actually was. Was this going to be a playful bit, or was Carson genuinely pissed and using the show to express it? Rickles would find out when the cameras started rolling. The curtain parts, Ed McMahon announces, "Here's Johnny." Johnny Carson walks out to thunderous applause. He does his monologue, makes jokes about the day's news. Everything seems normal. But the regular viewers knew, when Don Rickles is scheduled, anything can happen. Carson sits at his desk, the famous desk with the now-replaced cigarette box prominently displayed, and goes through the opening segments of the show. And then it's time. My next guest, Carson says, his voice carrying just a hint of something, edge, annoyance, anticipation, is a very funny man, one of my favorite people. But we have something we need to discuss tonight. The audience laughs, sensing drama. Ladies and gentlemen, Don Rickles. Don Rickles walked onto the Tonight Show stage to massive applause. But even from his entrance, you could tell something was different. Usually, Rickles came out with swagger, confidence, ready to destroy everyone in the room. But tonight, he looked slightly nervous. His smile was a bit more tentative. He waved to the audience, but there was something in his body language that said, "I'm not entirely sure how this is going to go." He shook Johnny's hand, sat down, and waited. The audience was on the edge of their seats. Johnny Carson looked at Don Rickles. The audience was silent, waiting. Don Carson began, his voice serious. "We need to talk about something. You were on my set recently when I wasn't here." Rickles immediately started deflecting with humor. "Johnny, it's NBC property. I work here too, I thought." Carson cut him off. And something unfortunate. The audience started laughing, sensing where this was going. Rickles tried to derail it with an insult. "Johnny, you look great tonight. Did you finally fire your barber or—" "Don, my cigarette box." The audience exploded with laughter. The Carson's mock outrageous was Carson's performance. He played the wounded, betrayed friend perfectly. "This cigarette box," Carson continued, gesturing to the new one on his desk, "has been on this desk for years. It was a gift. It was special to me. And you destroyed it." His voice carried mock hurt, genuine annoyance, and underlying amusement all at once. It was a masterclass in comedic acting. Rickles tried to explain, "Johnny, it was an accident. I didn't mean to." "An accident," Carson interrupted. "You came onto my set, when I wasn't here, and you broke my personal possession." The audience was howling. The cameras cut back and forth between Carson's wounded dignity and Rickles' squirming discomfort. Don Rickles, never one to apologize seriously, went into full defensive mode. but in the most Don Rickles way possible. Johnny, first of all, I was giving a tour to some important people, network executives. I was showing them the greatest talk show in television history. By breaking my things, Carson deadpanned. I wanted them to feel welcome. I sat in your chair, which, by the way, needs new padding. I almost injured my back. The audience roared, and I was doing my Johnny Carson impression, which is flawless, and I'm not saying who, I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. Don, Carson interrupted. You broke the box. The desk is too crowded. You've got pens, papers, that ridiculous cup of pencils. Carson held up the new cigarette box. It was right here, in the center, where it always is. How did you accidentally destroy it? What followed was several minutes of the most brilliant back-and-forth comedy. Carson would make a statement about his wounded feelings. Rickles would deflect with an insult or an outrageous explanation. Carson would respond with perfect deadpan delivery. Rickles would scramble trying to make excuses, while also making jokes. The audience was in stitches. The cameras captured every moment. Carson's barely suppressed smile. Rickles' animated hand gestures. The perfect comedy timing between two masters of their craft. At one point, Rickles tried to turn it around. Johnny, you're being very petty about this. It's a cigarette box. It's not a family heirloom. Carson responded, it was my cigarette box, on my desk, in my studio, that you broke. I'll buy you a new one, Rickles protested. You did buy me a new one, Carson said, gesturing to the box on his desk. This is it. Then what are you complaining about? Rickles exclaimed, throwing his hands up. The audience absolutely lost it. Carson then took it even further. He pretended to be a prosecutor cross-examining Rickles. So you admit you were on my set? Yes, but... And you admit you touched my property? And you admit the box was broken during your visit? Johnny, you're making this sound like a crime. It is a crime, Don. Breaking and entering, destruction of property. Rickles tried to deflect. Ed, help me out here, he called to Ed McMahon, who was sitting on the couch next to him. Isn't Johnny being unreasonable? Ed, playing along perfectly. Don, you broke the man's cigarette box. Not you too, Rickles exclaimed, and the audience roared again. Then something interesting happened. In the middle of all the comedy, there was a flash of genuine emotion. Rickles stopped the rapid-fire deflections for a moment and looked at Carson seriously. Johnny, I am sorry. Really. I know it was important to you. I should have been more careful. And I should have told you right away instead of hoping you wouldn't notice. The audience applauded the genuine apology. Carson looked at Rickles, and you could see the real friendship in his eyes. I know you are, Don, and I forgive you. Then immediately, but I'm never letting you on my set again. Rickles fired back, like I want to come back to this dump anyway. And they were off again, the comedy continuing. Ladies and gentlemen, despite his destructive tendencies, please welcome Don Rickles. He'd successfully talked his way through the confrontation, made everyone laugh, and somehow came out the hero despite being the guilty party. As they went to commercial, you could see Carson and Rickles laughing together, the genuine affection between them obvious. It had been a perfect piece of television, real situation, real emotions, real friendship, and real comedy. The cigarette box segment became instant television legend. The next day, everyone who'd watched The Tonight Show was talking about it. At work, at school, at dinner tables, people were recounting Rickles' desperate deflections and Carson's mock outrage. In an era before DVRs and YouTube, if you missed it, which made those who'd seen it feel special, they'd witnessed something remarkable. The NBC switchboard was flooded with calls from people asking when they could see it again. This was 1973. You couldn't just rewatch things. If you wanted to see it again, you had to hope NBC would rerun the segment on a best of special. So-called for the rest of his life, Don Rickles told the cigarette box story. On other talk shows, at roasts, in interviews. In his memoir, The story became part of his personal mythology. "I broke Johnny Carson's cigarette box" became a signature anecdote. He'd tell it with slightly different details each time. Sometimes he was the one who knocked it over. Sometimes it was someone else. Sometimes the box was more or less expensive, but the core remained. He'd screwed up, and Johnny had turned it into comedy gold. Rickles always spoke about the moment with a mixture of pride and affection. Pride that he'd been part of such a legendary Tonight Show moment. Affection for his friend Johnny, who'd taken a potentially awkward situation and made it work for both of them. "Johnny could have killed me," Rickles said in one interview. "Instead, he gave me one of the best segments I ever did on his show. That's friendship, that's trust, that's two performers who understood each other completely." Johnny Carson rarely discussed the moment in depth, but when he did, you could hear the warmth in his voice. In interviews after his retirement, when asked about his favorite Tonight Show moments, the cigarette box confrontation with Rickles almost always came up. "That was Don at his best," Carson said. "He came on not knowing exactly how I was going to play it, and he just improvised his way through it. Made it funny, made it memorable. That's what made Don special. The audience knew we actually liked each other," he said. "So they could laugh at the confrontation because they understood it was coming from a place of love." The cigarette box moment remains one of the most celebrated in Tonight Show history. Why? 1. It was real. This wasn't scripted. This actually happened. The cigarette box was really broken. Rickles really was nervous. Carson really turned it into a bit. That authenticity comes through. 2. It showcased genuine friendship. Modern late-night TV often feels calculated. Celebrities come on to promote products. Everything feels managed, but the Carson-Rickles cigarette box segment showed real friendship, real trust, real affection underneath the comedy. 3. It was brilliantly executed. Both men were at the height of their powers. Carson's mock outrage, Rickles' desperate deflections, the timing, the back and forth. It was a masterclass in comedy. 4. It could never happen today. In the age of social media and viral moments, everything feels performative. The cigarette box moment happened when television could still genuinely surprise you, when two masters could take a real situation and turn it into art. 5. It represents a lost era. The segment represents everything that was great about The Tonight Show during the Carson years. The spontaneity, the trust between host and guest, the willingness to take risks, the understanding that sometimes the best television comes from real life, not from scripts. The friendship pact possible was what it revealed about Carson and Rickles' friendship. They trusted each other completely. Carson knew that Rickles could handle being put on the spot. Rickles knew that Carson wasn't genuinely angry, that this was an opportunity for great television. That kind of trust is rare in any relationship, but especially rare in Hollywood. These were two men at the top of their profession, with egos and reputations to protect. But their friendship was secure enough that they could play with fire on live television, and know that neither would get burned. Off camera, Carson and Rickles remained close until Carson's death in 2005. They'd have dinner together, call each other. They were genuinely in each other's lives, not just professional acquaintances who smiled for the cameras. When Carson died, Rickles was devastated. "I lost my best friend," he said. "Johnny was, there's nobody like him. Nobody." And at Rickles' memorial service in 2017, the cigarette box story was told again, because it captured everything beautiful about their relationship. The humor, the trust, the love disguised as insults, and the mutual respect between two legends. One fun postscript: what happened to the actual broken cigarette box? According to Tonight Show lore, Carson kept the pieces. They were gathered up and put in a bag or box somewhere in his office. The replacement box, the one shown during the Rickles confrontation, stayed on Carson's desk for years, a permanent reminder of one of the show's greatest moments. And every time Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show after that incident, there would be at least one joke about the cigarette box. It became a running gag that lasted for years. "Don't touch anything," Carson would say when Rickles sat down. Especially not the cigarette box, Rickles would fire back. And the audience would laugh, remembering the legendary moment when the master of insult comedy got roasted by the king of late night. In 1973, Don Rickles broke Johnny Carson's cigarette box. It was an accident. A moment of carelessness on The Tonight Show set that could have been handled quietly, privately, with a simple apology and a replacement. But Johnny Carson saw an opportunity. He took a potentially awkward situation and transformed it into one of the most memorable moments in television history. He invited Rickles onto the show, confronted him publicly, played the wounded friend, let Rickles scramble and deflect and make it funny. And what emerged was a perfect encapsulation of everything that made The Tonight Show special during the Carson era. It was real, it was spontaneous. It showcased genuine friendship between two legends. It was brilliantly funny without being mean. It took a risk and trusted the audience to come along for the ride. The cigarette box moment represents a type of television that doesn't really exist anymore. In the age of viral videos and carefully managed celebrity brands, everything feels calculated. Nothing feels spontaneous. But on that night in 1973, two masters of entertainment took a broken object and created something unbreakable. A moment that has been celebrated and remembered for 50 years and will be remembered for 50 more. Don Rickles destroyed Johnny Carson's prized possession. But in doing so, they created something far more valuable. A perfect moment of television that reminds us why we fell in love with these shows in the first place. Because sometimes, the best entertainment comes from real life, from genuine friendship, from two people who trust each other enough to turn disaster into comedy gold. The cigarette box was broken, but the friendship never was. And that's what made it legendary. Have you seen the actual cigarette box confrontation between Johnny Carson and Don Rickles? If you haven't, track it down. It's one of the greatest unscripted moments in television history. What's your favorite Johnny Carson and Don Rickles moment? Drop it in the comments below. And if you loved this story about two legends turning a real-life accident into comedy gold, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more untold stories from the golden age of television. Because these moments matter, these friendships matter, and these stories deserve to be remembered. Thanks for watching.